Why is it racist to show your ID to vote? It's not. But the claim is that minorities have less access to photo IDs. I feel that the Democrats' platform on this shouldn't be that we don't need IDs, but that every citizen should have access to a free ID. I recall hearing of indigenous peoples being told to fuck themselves because their birth certificates from a reservation weren't considered legit documents. It's not the ID. It's getting one. The people making these laws find out what thing the group of people they don't want to vote don't have or can't get, and they make that thing a requirement for valid ID. For example, requiring a fixed postal address seems reasonable until you realize that a majority of Native Americans use P.O. boxes. Now they can't vote. These hundreds of weird requirements you can invent for a valid ID. Medical insurance info, housing history with references, tax records, driver's license in areas with few drivers. It's not explicitly racist, it simply can have racist effects. In America, your ID is probably your driver's license. We don't have national ID programs. And getting an ID costs money. If you have no need for a car, for instance, you live in a city, or passport, you probably don't have ID. Especially if you're poor. Economic classes are generally split along racial lines. So if you've required ID for voting, and poor people generally don't have ID, you've made it harder for poor people to vote. Since most of those poor people are minorities, you've indirectly made it harder for them to vote. My mother is in as assisted living and her state ID expired a few years ago. To get her a new one, I would have had to bring her to the DMV during COVID. Even before COVID, we would have had to wait hours. She is in a wheelchair and on oxygen, and it would have been a nearly impossible task. She has literally no reason to have an ID. More accurately, it disenfranchises disenfranchised people. If you have to work long hours and take care of kids, and just have life in the way, the cost in terms of time and money in getting an ID would mean that there are some people who are eligible voters but cannot vote due to the cost of obtaining an ID. Aside from costs, there can be extenuating circumstances that made obtaining an ID more difficult. That one might think: changing residence, having your ID stolen, losing documents in a fire, having documents withheld by an abusive partner. There are many ways in which an otherwise eligible voter could not have the proper documentation to obtain an ID. The supposed reason behind ID laws is to prevent fraud. But there are a few critical incongruencies in this stance that betrays the true intention. So, let's say that IDs were an effective way to curb voter fraud. It already is so rare it's virtually a non-issue. So ID requirements solve a non-existent problem. Then if the issue was simply that Republicans should in theory roll out a program to give each eligible voter a free and automatically issued federal voter ID. We already get a social security card. So such a program should be possible once they turn 18. But why not? Why not even propose such a measure, even if they think it won't pass, just to show where they stand? It's because the ID law isn't about preventing fraud but preventing certain people from voting. Certain people that just happen to be short on time and money and may be dealing with extenuating circumstance A. Now, you can't openly say you're targeting certain groups. So instead, you use just acceptable criteria that just happen to include the group you actually want to target. Poor blacks, Asians, Hispanics, whites, etc. all would be disenfranchised by voter ID laws. But if a group is a minority of a population, it is disproportionately affected. So even if a greater hash of white voters are disenfranchised, a larger percent of a smaller black population would be affected, assuming that other variables are equal. So, it's not racist per se, but it is definitely classist in. Since it is still socially acceptable to be classist, it is used as a tool to give plausible deniability to the true intent, which is to disenfranchise voters based on race or political allegiance. The voter ID isn't the racist part. When these laws started to go into effect, DMVs in predominantly minority neighborhoods were closed. Polling places to cast the votes were being removed, so people have to wait 11 hours in line in these places. Then they turn around and say you can't give food or water to people in line because that means you're trying to sway their vote. It's not. It's just a political football kicked around to score points. Republicans exaggerate the level of election fraud. Let's be clear. There's some in every election. But it's statistically insignificant. And Democrats pretend to be oh so pearl-clutching concerned for minorities. As if minority equals Democrat. You know. Like all the Catholic ones who don't like adoration and voted for Orange Man. If Republicans really cared about election fraud, they'd make it easy to get an ID. If Democrats really cared about how hard it is for minorities to get an ID, they'd make it easy to get an ID. Hey look, the easiest solution solves the issue for both parties. But instead we're stuck in a loop pretending ID documents could only ever be issued by the fucking DMV. Much of the rest of the world requires an ID to vote. It's only in the richest country in the world where this is somehow an insurmountable problem. Because in America you aren't required to get a national ID card. And the reasoning for requiring it in order to vote is specifically because certain groups disproportionately don't have IDs, and those same groups tend to vote for the Democratic Party. If they wanted to take this seriously, they could talk about creating a national identification system that everyone gets and requiring it for all kinds of things. But oh wait, if you do that, guess which party will say it's the fucking Illuminati trying to put squids in our brains? Edit. And actually literally within the past week Republicans said, DEMERCRATS want to NATINOANZLISE. Elections, like wanting to have national standards for national elections would be some crackpot scam. In my country your ID is literally the only thing you need to vote. You show it. They take your info and then ready to vote. The US is a bit unique in that we don't have a national ID like most other countries. So it's a bit of a US-specific issue. We also tend to be more diverse. So there can be disparate impacts. Instead, the states do IDs. The main forms of ID here are driver's license or state ID. Both you get at a state DMV. 90% of people have one. But it's known that there are racial disparities in who has an ID and what form of ID they use. Also, I should note that every state has some form of identifying voters who vote. It's not just a free-for-all. In short, it's known that there are racial disparities in who has an ID and what form of ID they use. What? Isn't that supposed to be standard procedure? Here in India everyone has at least 3 kind of IDs. 2 personal IDs and 1 family ID. If you want to get some official work done you have to present your ID in document. Basically it boils down to the fact that most people who have IDs have it in the form of a driver's license. And most Americans don't have passports. Technically, there is no requirement for people to get a national ID. They are issued by your state. And there is no legal requirement to have one in most states unless you want a driver's license, as much as the police might insist otherwise. So people who do not drive are not legally required to have an ID in most states. Conservatives, I think, are kind of hypocritical on this because they are the ones who push for voter IDs, but would also be less inclined to enact laws that require everyone to actually have an ID or any solution for people to be issued them at no charge. So because of that, it can be seen as racist because it would inevitably mean that people who don't already have a driver's license or a passport, I guess that would be more minorities, but IDK for sure, would not be able to vote unless they went and jumped through hoops to get a state ID. It is when they start closing DMVs in areas that are passing these laws with high concentrations of certain demographics to reduce access. https www.bloomberg.com/news/articles/2015-10-01/alabama-closes-year-after-voter-id-law-key. CKS in. It is reasonable to make everyone prove who they are to vote. You have to prove who you are to get an ID. And so states have a list of ways you can do so in order to get one. When you go vote, showing an ID is easiest, but if you don't have an ID, you can just prove who you are using one of the listed ways. Right? Well, the new laws are changing that so that when you go vote you can only use some or most of the ways, instead of any of the ways. And the ways that they've removed happen to affect people they may not want voting. Last I looked at the Texas law, paperwork proving a name change that the state accepts to handle a name change is not acceptable when you vote. So if anyone does a name change and doesn't get everything updated exactly right, no voting. I wonder who that affects. It isn't inherently racist to show your ID to vote. Voter ID laws are just frequently designed to specifically block certain groups, Black people, from voting. Black people are already less likely to have certain forms of ID, like driver's licenses. And Republicans have actively taken steps like closing down DMVs to make it more difficult for them to obtain them. You then have states like North Carolina where the legislature commissioned a study on how common certain forms of ID were, and then implemented a voter ID law that didn't allow people to vote using the forms of ID that Black people were most likely to have. The law was thankfully struck down for clearly being unconstitutional and racist. But many aren't, because they aren't so blatant. These laws are often clearly designed to limit the number of Black people voting, because Black people are much more likely to vote Democrat, and certain Republican politicians are willing to put fundamental civil rights below their own and their party's success. It's not racist, it's classist because IDs aren't free and easy to get. We do not have any national IDs other than social security numbers. And we are not supposed to share those ever. The right in America is, in general, very against any national registries. We also have at least 50 different election systems for national elections. So each state would have their own regulations on what constitutes that ID and how to get it. It will always be harder for poor people, as they will not have access to the places to get it, nor will they easily meet the requirements. In America we have an existing voter ID system. It's called the voter registration card, and you show it or something that embeds its information to vote. The real question is, why do we need something else? Getting a state-approved ID in New Jersey is a nightmare of red tape. You need a bank card, a SS card, a birth certificate, a copy of a lease, a phone or electric bill, and tons of other things to prove that you are really you? It's complete horseshit. A bank card should in no way validate you. It is more so classist than it is directly racist, but what is interesting that there is no real push to have a national ID.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. TooAfraidToAsk is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.